Hi, everyone. Today I wanted to talk about a paper I published back in 2020 called Climate Change, Individual Emissions, and Agent Regret. It's a short paper that appeared in the journal Analysis, and it addresses the question of how individual greenhouse gas emitters should regard their individual emissions. So there's no question that climate change as a whole is a very serious problem, um, and that it risks causing great harm to human beings now and in the future. It takes many different varieties. A lot of people are expected to die as a result of climate change, have their lives negatively impacted, and there will be vast economic costs. Just how bad it's going to be depends on a variety of factors, including how we choose to respond to it. So you might think that individuals like you and me, as a result of that, have obligations to avoid uh, emitting, at least to try and reduce our emissions as much as practically feasible for us. Otherwise, we're contributing to a problem that's clearly very damaging, and you might think it's unethical to make the problem worse. There is a problem, though. In a paper written a few years ago by the philosopher Walter Sinnott Armstrong, um, we see the argument that any individual act of greenhouse gas emissions, so say his example is going for a Sunday drive just for fun, and that's something that somebody has to do. You don't need it to go to work or do anything important, it's just for fun. Something like that does contribute to climate change because there are some greenhouse gas emissions as a result of that activity. But it's so minor that he argues there's really no ethical theory that clearly entails that the person who goes for the Sunday drive is acting wrongly, that they're doing something impermissible. And a big reason for that is simply how trivial the contribution is. So, for a couple hours of driving, yes, there are some emissions, but not on a scale that anyone will ever notice any difference whatsoever. So if somebody chooses not to go on that Sunday drive, it's not as if you can point to clear cases of avoided harm. Right? We can't say, well, this person would have died over here had I gone for the ride. It doesn't work like that. Again, because the emitting activity in question is so minor. So it's not that Senator Armstrong doesn't think that this is a huge problem, climate change. It's just he thinks that it's an issue, at least it becomes an ethical issue, at the level of society and government. So he thinks that the obligation should be on governments to address the problem because they're the ones that actually have the leverage to make serious cuts in our emissions overall as communities. And they could do that through a variety of means. So passing laws, including carbon taxes or providing incentives for switching to renewable energy, things like that. Um, so he makes the argument then that the individual emitter, people like you and me who are just driving our cars around or flying on airplanes, something like that, even when we're doing those things for, say, just self-interested purposes, right? So we're not driving an ambulance to save someone's life, for example, but just driving for fun. He says, somewhat surprisingly, that there's nothing morally wrong with that, even though that very action, multiplied over millions of people, adds up to a very seriously harmful phenomenon in climate change. So there have been a variety of responses to that kind of argument. Some people have tried to show that, well, even though an individual act might not contribute very much to the problem, one's lifetime emissions sure can. So, for example, John Nolt has argued that, with doing some rough calculations, that the average American's lifetime emissions statistically would work out to be responsible for approximately 2 additional deaths as a result. So you live your life as an average American. Yep, I guess for some reason you want to do that. Your emissions over that time add up to being quite a bit, and you've essentially killed 2 people, is his argument, roughly put. And that's interesting. But you might object to it by pointing out that still, the individual actions themselves are not causing much or any harm, right? The individual plane flight, the individual drive in the car, those actions themselves do not themselves cause any noticeable harm because, again, the emissions from them are so minor. So you might wonder, how could it be that if we add up a bunch of harmless and seemingly blameless acts, we would end up with something that we could morally assess in a negative light? So how can we say you are morally responsible for 2 additional deaths because of all of these individual actions that you took part in, where those individual actions are not themselves clearly wrong in any individual and obvious sense? Now, there's a lot of debate there back and forth, and a position like Nolt's may indeed work out. Maybe you could make a convincing case for that. But let's suppose that that doesn't work. Let's say that Senator Armstrong has the right side of this, and it is the case that the individual does nothing wrong in going for a ride just for fun, even though that contributes to a big problem. So my approach in the short paper that I mentioned, and I'll have a link below to freely available version if you want to look at the abstract or the paper itself. In this paper, I argue that if Senator Armstrong is right, then the appropriate attitude to adopt is one of what we call agent regret. So agent regret is a concept that's usually associated with the philosopher Bernard Williams. And you can think of it as an attitude that the agent, the actor, feels regarding some action that she has committed. And it's one of regret. One wishes that it had not happened, that things had not worked out the way that they did as a result of her actions. His example is a truck driver who accidentally kills an innocent person. So somebody crossing the street and isn't looking, and they slam on the brakes, but it's too late, and they run over the person, and the person dies. And let's assume there are different versions of this, but let's assume that the driver did nothing wrong. So they weren't texting. They hadn't. It isn't the case that they failed to check their brakes. They weren't under the influence of any sort of drug or anything like that. They really did all that they could have reasonably to try and avoid this terrible outcome, but they couldn't. Right. So it's just bad luck that this terrible thing happened as a result of this person's actions, driving the truck at that place and that time. But in this scenario, most of us would agree that the driver has not done anything wrong. Right. They're not morally blameworthy for the death. However, imagine that person just doesn't feel any regret at all. Right. So imagine the driver simply doesn't care in the sense that they might say, well, it's not my fault. The person shouldn't have been walking there, and they were. That's on them, and they're dead now, and I don't feel bad at all, right? And, imagine, you were asked that by the relatives of the person who died, and you expressed no regret. You said, like, yeah, it's bad that they died. Sure, I can recognize that, but it has nothing to do with me. It's not my fault, and I don't regret anything that I did. So William says something along the lines of, we would look at this person in a less than favorable light, right? We might think, yeah, sure, you're not blameworthy for what happened, but on the other hand, the fact that you're not feeling any sort of negative attitude, that you don't have specifically a feeling of regret regarding what happened, that doesn't sound quite right. There's something off about that. And the attitude of agent regret is supposed to fill that in, to allow us to say, yes, I regret what happened, even though it couldn't have been otherwise. I wish the outcome had been different. I wish that I hadn't been driving right at that place and at that time. And I recognize the misfortune of that, right? It's a terrible thing. And in some way, I feel bad about it. Even though I recognize, let's say, that I'm not morally responsible for what happened. It's not my fault. I didn't do anything wrong. As opposed to, say, if I had been driving negligently and then killed someone, then you might say, well, then you are morally blameworthy. But in this case, we assume you're not morally blameworthy. That still leaves room for us to feel agent regret, because that doesn't involve the judgment that I did something morally wrong. It just involves the attitude that my actions had this bad outcome in this case, uh, and that I wish that that had not happened, right? Um, so I make the argument that if Senate Armstrong is correct about individual emissions not being blameworthy, then we can account for how the person should feel by relying on this concept of agent regret. So, in short, uh, I argue that we should feel regret about the emissions that we individuals make, even though they're relatively trivial compared to other sources or the overall problem. We should nonetheless regret the fact that our actions are contributing um, to an issue that has a great degree of what I call moral disvalue. So, climate change, even if I'm not at fault personally for it, let's assume, there's no question that there's a lot of morally bad things associated with climate change. So, a great deal of harm, including death for many innocent people, including those who are low emitters, now and in the future. A great deal of injustice in terms of how the harms and various costs of climate change are distributed. So, again, those of us as individuals and countries that contribute most to the problem are likely not to be those who pay the worst price for climate change in the future. So the much of the harm will be felt by those who are least responsible for the problem, and that just works out due to bad luck, right? So geographical reasons and things like that, poverty. So that's bad stuff, right? And the worry is, my worry at least, if we just accept Senator Armstrong's argument at face value, then that seems to make it natural, or at least leaves it open, for us to adopt the sort of attitude that that Williams says seems off, right? And seems less than admirable, something we'd want to avoid. Namely, saying, sure, I'm contributing in a small way to an issue that's going to kill thousands of people in the best of circumstances, um, but I don't feel bad about it at all, right? I don't care. I don't feel any regret. It's not on me to fix the problem. The government should do something, right? You might say. Um, that's, I think, not a desirable disposition to have towards the problem, because it doesn't seem to take seriously the, as I said, moral disvalue that is clearly present in climate change. And the fact that I am an agent, even a minor one, contributing to the problem is something that should trouble me in some way. I should regret that fact. That might also motivate me to try and do something politically about it, or to contribute to causes that are trying to address the problem. But that's a different issue. This is just about how the individual should regard his or her involvement with this morally bad issue. So the neat thing about agent regret is that it allows us to have this negative evaluation of something that I've done, even though I judge, let's say correctly, that I'm not morally to blame for the problem. So it's not my fault. Nonetheless, I should feel bad about it, right? I am contributing to a seriously bad thing. And even if that contribution is morally blameless, nonetheless, I ought to recognize, in some sense of ought, that that's a bad thing. So this very short argument and the paper that presents that argument is really meant to provide in some ways a kind of middle ground between simply dismissing my involvement with climate change and saying it doesn't matter at all. It's somebody else's problem to deal with. versus blaming individuals for their emissions. So on the one hand, Senator Armstrong has a good point that um, the biggest emitters and those with the most power to do something about it are large institutions and governments. Well, like the United States government, for example, has a lot of leverage in addressing climate change and has not done very much, and in fact um, has hindered progress on addressing climate change in the past. Um, so he certainly has a point there, but nonetheless, the individuals can recognize that we're still doing something bad when we go for a Sunday drive, even if we're not morally blameworthy for it. Okay, so that's the basic idea. Like I said, link below to a free version of the paper and the abstract. Thanks for watching.